She was 2 seconds away from being dragged off the plane, humiliated, furious, helpless, while the woman who ordered it sipped champagne like nothing had happened. And yet, in that same cabin, just rows away, sat the truth that would bring an entire empire crashing down. What happens when the people you underestimate the most turn out to be the ones holding all the power? This isn't just another story about airline drama. This is about identity, arrogance, and what it means to belong in spaces not designed for you. It's about a black couple who boarded with dignity and were treated like intruders. It's about a granddaughter who watched her family be humiliated, then flipped the script with a single phone call. And it's about a woman who thought first class gave her permission to look down on everyone else until she found out who was really looking back. Think you know where this is going? Think again. Before we dive into this story of justice at 35,000 feet, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your country or city in the comments. What would you have done if this happened in front of you? Do you think people like her should be banned from flying for life? And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who's ever been told they don't belong, because this one's for them. Let's begin. Claire Bancroft stepped onto the jet bridge with the same commanding air she wore in every boardroom across the globe, her stilettos clicking a sharp rhythm against the polished floor. Her assistant, barely keeping pace, trailed behind her with a tablet clutched tightly to his chest, eyes scanning calendar alerts while trying not to fall behind. Claire didn't acknowledge him, nor the flight attendant who stood at attention near the aircraft door with a practiced smile and a soft, "Welcome aboard, Ms. Bancroft." She didn't return the greeting, just offered a perfunctory nod as she entered the cabin, her eyes already surveying the layout of first class like a general inspecting her front line. Everything gleamed exactly as it should: the hand-stitched leather seats, the curved chrome accents, the dim golden lighting designed to flatter and impress. Claire had flown private more times than she could count, but when forced to share space with the public, she ensured it was only with the select few who, like her, understood the price of exclusivity. That illusion, however, cracked the moment her gaze landed on the passengers in seats 1A and 1B. An elderly black couple, dignified and composed, sat comfortably side by side. The man, tall and well-groomed, wore a tailored charcoal suit, his posture upright despite age. The woman beside him, wrapped in a deep burgundy shawl, was reading softly from a small leather-bound book, her pearl earrings catching the light. There was nothing out of place about them, not in appearance, not in behavior. Yet Claire's brow subtly lifted as a flicker of disdain passed through her eyes. She turned slightly toward her assistant and said under her breath, "Did they expand the charity upgrade program while I was gone?" Her assistant pretended not to hear, though the flight attendant nearby clearly did, her face freezing mid-smile. Claire took her seat across the aisle in 1D, without a word to the couple, her posture rigid, her movements crisp, her silence intentional. From the moment she sat, her discomfort began to build, though she wouldn't name it as such. To her, it wasn't discomfort, it was disruption. These two didn't fit her vision of who belonged here, and their calm, unbothered presence only magnified the offense. As Evelyn leaned gently toward Walter to adjust his collar, Claire watched from the corner of her eye, her fingers tightening on the armrest. There was no overt act to justify her reaction, no rule being broken, but the very fact that they didn't seem aware of her superiority gnawed at her. She expected subtle deference. She got none. Instead, the couple interacted with their surroundings and each other as if their presence in first class was normal, earned, deserved, which to Claire was the problem. She snapped her fingers toward the passing attendant. "Rachel," she said without looking up, "I'll take the Laurent Perrier, extra chilled, and send someone to adjust the cabin lighting. It's feeling a little." "Coach." Rachel nodded, stepping quickly toward the galley, her expression tight. Claire retrieved her phone and began scrolling through emails, but her attention repeatedly drifted back to 1A and 1B. She caught Walter reading a hardcover book titled The Soul of America, and for some reason, that annoyed her more. Claire didn't know why, or maybe she did. She just didn't like the way they seemed to belong. Evelyn turned briefly, offering a polite nod across the aisle. Claire didn't return it. Instead, she pulled a silk scarf from her bag, dabbed beneath her eyes, and muttered, "God, I hope they don't talk the whole flight." Her assistant glanced up from his tablet, sensing trouble brewing, but said nothing. Claire sipped the champagne that Rachel brought moments later, her face twisting as the bubbles hit her tongue. "Too warm," she complained. "Try again. I want it cold enough to burn." As Rachel retreated, Claire's eyes locked again on the couple. Her voice lowered to a venomous whisper as she leaned toward her assistant. They should be grateful to even be allowed on this aircraft, let alone seated in the front row. Her assistant froze. Claire continued, "You'd think people like that would know their place by now." At that moment, Evelyn laughed softly at something her husband whispered. Claire stiffened. The sound, gentle, warm, content, hit her like a slap. She felt invisible, ignored, unimportant. In her world, no one ignored Claire Bancroft. The very idea that someone could share her air, occupy the same space, and not acknowledge her presence with awe or fear, it was an insult she couldn't let stand. She tapped the seat back in front of her, calling Rachel over again. "I want a full manifest of this cabin. And I want to know if those two," she nodded discreetly toward the couple, "were actually booked into first class, or if someone bumped them up at the last second to fill seats." Rachel hesitated, unsure whether to answer or flee. Claire added coldly, "Don't make me repeat myself." Rachel nodded, disappearing toward the galley once more. Claire Bancroft settled deeper into her leather seat, legs crossed with mechanical elegance, and pulled out her tablet, though her focus remained on the couple across the aisle. Every few seconds, her eyes darted toward them, not in curiosity, but with a simmering resentment that grew with each moment they failed to acknowledge her superiority. Walter had removed his jacket and folded it neatly over his lap, now browsing the in-flight magazine with an air of calm intelligence that irritated Claire more than any outburst could have. Evelyn, meanwhile, had adjusted her seat and was now thumbing through a crossword puzzle, her demeanor serene, as if the world outside her bubble didn't matter, a privilege Claire reserved only for herself. The more they ignored her presence, the louder the insult echoed in Claire's mind. She sipped her now properly chilled champagne and placed the glass down harder than necessary on the tray. Without looking up from her tablet, she lifted her hand and signaled Rachel with a sharp flick of her fingers. "What is that smell?" she asked flatly when the attendant appeared, her nose wrinkling ever so slightly. Rachel blinked in confusion, unsure if there was an actual issue. "Ma'am." Claire tilted her head toward the couple and whispered just loud enough, "I'm not sure if someone brought a deli with them, but it's not what I expect in first class." Rachel hesitated, caught between professionalism and discomfort, before murmuring a quick apology and stepping away. Claire smirked, pleased with herself, then resumed pretending to read, though her attention was still focused like a laser on every breath, every movement coming from one A and one B. A few minutes later, Walter leaned forward slightly and, with a polite voice, asked, "Excuse me, ma'am, would you mind passing me the magazine from your seat pocket? I believe that's the issue I was looking for." Claire didn't even glance at him. She blinked slowly, as if the question hadn't reached her, then continued scrolling on her screen. Only when Walter repeated himself, this time with a gentle tap on the edge of her seat divider, did she shift her eyes toward him, expression neutral but charged with disdain. She said nothing, simply reached for the magazine, pinched it at the very edge of one corner as if touching it were somehow unsanitary, and handed it over with 2 fingers. Walter accepted it graciously, offering a soft, "Thank you kindly." Claire didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a travel-sized disinfectant wipe, and began scrubbing her fingers slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact with the seat back in front of her. The message was clear, and she wanted it to be. Evelyn glanced at her husband, who gave the faintest shake of his head, signaling restraint. They both knew this game, had played it their entire lives in rooms where they weren't expected, respected, or accepted. Evelyn returned to her puzzle, Walter to his reading, but Claire didn't stop. The very idea that her subtle jabs had no visible effect made her itch with frustration. She turned to her assistant and whispered behind her hand, "Do you think they even know how much this seat costs? Or is this some kind of make-a-wish charity thing?" Her assistant looked away, pretending not to hear, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. When Rachel passed by again offering amenities, Claire waved her off. "No thanks. I've already lost my appetite," she muttered, glancing sideways at Walter, then back to her screen. Then, with mock sincerity, she turned to the couple and asked, "So, is this your first time in first class? Or are you regulars on these kinds of flights now?" Her tone was drenched in condescension, a snake coiled in silk. Walter looked up calmly. "We've flown quite a bit," he replied evenly. Evelyn added with a gentle smile, "More than we'd like to lately." Claire arched a brow, still not satisfied. "Must be nice. Things are certainly changing, aren't they? Used to be only certain people sat up here." She sipped her drink again, watching for a reaction. But she got none. That only pushed her further. She picked up the airline safety card and, speaking louder than necessary, commented to her assistant, "I hope they go over emergency procedures extra carefully today. We have some undertrained flyers on board." This time, a man 2 rows back frowned, then shook his head. Evelyn reached into her purse for a mint and offered one to Walter. Claire narrowed her eyes. To her, their silence wasn't grace, it was defiance. She felt as though they were mocking her by doing nothing at all. She couldn't stand it. She needed them to acknowledge that they were guests in her space, intruders in her air. As the cabin lights dimmed in preparation for takeoff, Claire leaned back in her seat, eyes narrowed in quiet fury. The Rhodes couple had remained composed through her every jab, and in doing so, had robbed her of the control she so desperately tried to reassert. It wasn't just about race to Claire, though she'd never admit it aloud. It was about power, presence, perception. And these two, with their poise and dignity, had somehow disrupted the order she believed the world should obey. Claire, seated as if the cabin had been designed around her, didn't bother to look up until Rachel addressed her. "Can I offer you something to drink, Ms. Bancroft?" Claire lifted her gaze slowly, then flicked it toward the couple across the aisle. "Just the Grand Siècle, please. And make sure it goes to the actual executives first. No sense wasting premium on amateurs." Her tone was casual, her face unreadable, but the message was deliberate and razor-sharp. Rachel hesitated just long enough to betray discomfort before nodding and pouring the champagne. Evelyn's fingers, which had been smoothing the edge of her husband's jacket, stilled. Her eyes didn't rise, but her breath hitched ever so slightly. Walter shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and replied, "We're quite capable of ordering for ourselves, thank you." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look directly at Claire. But his words carried quiet steel. Claire turned toward him then, that tight-lipped smile returning. "Of course you are. You seem very self-sufficient." Her gaze dropped momentarily to the scuffed edge of Walter's travel bag, then back up with practiced condescension. Always inspiring to see folks chasing a little taste of a high life. Evelyn looked at Walter, her lips parting as if to speak, then thinking better of it. Walter stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. The silence between them, once companionable, now felt like the pause before a tremor. Their seats, though plush and elegant, suddenly felt tighter. Evelyn's hands folded in her lap as she stared out the window, her reflection flickering faintly in the cabin glass. For a few long seconds, she said nothing. Then softly, almost too quiet to hear, she murmured, "Maybe we should have just taken a train." Walter didn't answer immediately. He knew that tone, measured, restrained, but not neutral. It was her way of saying this wasn't just another uncomfortable moment. This was different. "I'm not going to let that woman decide where we belong," he whispered back, his voice clipped. Evelyn gave a small nod, but her eyes didn't leave the clouds. "I know, but it's not just about her." Walter frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Evelyn hesitated, then sighed. "We've been dealing with this kind of thing our whole lives. And lately, I'm tired, Walter. It's like no matter how far we've come, we still have to keep proving it over and over to people who've never walked a day in our shoes." Walter leaned back in his seat, the old ache returning to his shoulders, not from age, but from the weight of constant dignity. He looked across at Claire, who was now laughing quietly with her assistant, no doubt about them. Evelyn was right. They had built a life, a legacy, and still, here they were being questioned for occupying space they'd rightfully earned. It made his hands tighten around the magazine he wasn't reading. And yet, a part of him refused to surrender. "She can think what she wants," he said, but there was a brittleness in his voice that hadn't been there before. Evelyn glanced at him then, her face softening, though the weariness didn't leave her eyes. "That's the problem, Walt. It's not just what she thinks. It's what it brings up. We spent our whole lives being told we didn't belong. And now that we're here, part of me wonders if we really want to stay." Walter turned sharply. "Don't say that. We do belong. You earned that seat, Evelyn." "So did I." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I know. But belonging and being welcome aren't always the same thing." Walter looked away. The sentence landed harder than he expected. Claire's voice, sweet and venomous, sliced back into the silence. "You know," she said, turning toward her assistant but speaking loud enough, "some people just aren't built for luxury. It makes them act out of character." She tilted her glass and took another slow sip. Walter's fists tightened in his lap. Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, but it lingered too long, almost like an anchor. Their silence now was no longer unified. It was taut, heavy with unsaid things. The shared strength that had carried them through decades of slights and silent battles felt strained. Walter, proud and grounded, wanted to fight back with presence. Evelyn, graceful and weary, wanted to step away before their dignity was stripped by 1,000 invisible cuts. When the assistant leaned toward Claire and asked quietly, "You really don't think they might be someone?" Claire chuckled under her breath. "If they are, then I've been living in a parallel universe. No one important shows up looking like that." Her voice was light, but Evelyn flinched. She didn't show it outwardly, but inside, something cracked. She had dressed with care that morning. She had chosen that shawl because it reminded her of their wedding trip to Paris. She had packed Walter's suit herself. Across the aisle, Walter and Evelyn sat side by side, but their closeness had shifted. The warmth between them now cooled by the slow poison of humiliation. Evelyn stared out the window, her shawl drawn tighter around her shoulders, not for warmth but for comfort, as if bracing against something colder than air. Walter held the in-flight magazine in his lap, unread, the pages limp between his fingers. His jaw tensed with every passing second Claire remained within earshot, her presence no longer just a nuisance, but an oppressive force they couldn't ignore. Claire suddenly pressed the call button above her seat. The chime echoed through first class. Rachel arrived with professional calm, but the stiffness in her shoulders betrayed the tension. Claire didn't lower her voice. "I'd like to speak to the cabin manager," she said. Immediately, Rachel blinked. "Is there a problem, Ms. Bancroft?" Claire gestured vaguely across the aisle. "Yes, there's been a seating mistake. 2 passengers are occupying seats that clearly weren't meant for them." Rachel's face remained neutral, though her breath quickened. "Those seats are confirmed, ma'am. I've checked." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Then check again. They don't belong here. I've flown this airline for years. I know what kind of clientele books row 1. Walter shifted slightly. Evelyn remained still. Neither of them spoke. Not yet. Rachel excused herself and returned moments later with the cabin supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Lewis, whose expression was already tight. "Ms. Bancroft," he said carefully, "I understand there's a concern." Claire gave a dismissive laugh. "Concern is putting it mildly. This is first class. And no offense, but this section isn't supposed to feel like a Greyhound bus." A few heads turned. The line had crossed from passive aggression to open offense. Rachel paled. Lewis stiffened. "Ma'am," he said, measured, "those passengers purchased their tickets legitimately. We do not discriminate based on appearance." Claire's eyes flashed. "No one said anything about discrimination. I'm simply stating the obvious. They don't look like first-class passengers. If you ask me, someone probably overrode the system last minute to fill empty seats. Maybe they got a charity code or a mileage redemption. It happens." Walter finally looked up. "Is that really necessary?" His voice was quiet but carried. Evelyn's hand gripped the armrest, her knuckles pale beneath her skin. Claire turned her gaze to him, as if just now remembering he had a voice. "I'm merely protecting the integrity of this space," she said. "Some of us paid real money to be here." "So did we," Evelyn said. Her tone was level, but behind her calm was a pain she was working hard to bury. "Full price. Early booking. Assigned seats." Claire scoffed. "I'm sure you did." Walter's shoulders stiffened. "Ma'am," he said, more firmly now, "if you have a problem, I suggest you take it up with corporate, not with us." Claire raised her brows, amused. "Believe me, I will. Though I doubt corporate has time for stories like yours." Her voice sliced clean, practiced like a blade. Evelyn closed her eyes. It wasn't just Claire's words, it was how easily they surfaced. How practiced the tone. How casual the venom. Around them, other passengers began to murmur. One woman too rose back, whispered, "Is she serious?" Another leaned forward, eyes darting between Walter and Evelyn, and then to Claire, as if watching a car wreck in slow motion. Evelyn turned to Walter, her voice barely above a breath. "Let's move seats," she whispered. Walter stared at her. "No, please," she said, her voice trembling now. "It's not worth it." "Yes," he replied, low and sharp, "it is." But the divide between them had grown. Evelyn no longer felt protected. She felt exposed. And for the first time in years, she wondered if their grace was a weakness. If silence had become surrender. Lewis cleared his throat. "MS. Bancroft, if you have further complaints, I ask that you submit them after the flight. The matter is settled." Claire looked him over like he was an intern who had interrupted a meeting. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. The old line, tired but still sharp in her mouth. Lewis didn't blink. "Yes, ma'am. And I know our policy." Claire let out a soft laugh, leaned back in her seat, and turned her gaze back toward the couple. "Enjoy your upgrade. I'm sure this will be a lovely story for your scrapbook." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice full but broken. "It's not an upgrade," she said, eyes fixed on the seat back ahead. "It's a seat we paid for. But you're right. It will be a story. One we've lived too many times." The silence that had settled over the first-class cabin after Claire's public humiliation attempt didn't last long. It fractured the moment Claire leaned forward in her seat, pressed the call button again, and spoke to Rachel as if the earlier exchange had not occurred at all. "I have a solution," she said with rehearsed elegance, her voice loud enough to carry. "Since these two seem so uncomfortable and, frankly, so out of place, why don't we simply move them to business class? That way, everyone gets what they want, and we restore the atmosphere this cabin was designed for." The statement landed like a slap in the face. A murmur rippled through the surrounding rows. Rachel blinked, clearly stunned, while Lewis, still nearby, took a slow step forward. Evelyn flinched. Walter inhaled deeply, his chest rising once deliberately before he spoke. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from sheer willpower. "We paid for these seats. We're not going anywhere." Claire turned her body toward them now, her expression shifting from patronizing to openly combative. "You're being unreasonable," she said. "This isn't personal. It's about maintaining standards. This cabin was meant for a certain type of experience. People expect a certain level of continuity." She smiled then, a thin blade of condescension tucked neatly beneath her lipstick. Evelyn turned to face Claire for the first time, her eyes sharp despite the tremble in her hands. "And what kind of experience do you think we are ruining exactly?" she asked, her tone measured but laced with years of restrained fury. Claire waved a dismissive hand. "Look, I'm trying to be civil here. You clearly don't understand how these things work." Walter stood slowly, the tension in his back making the movement look heavier than it should have. "We understand just fine," he said. "We understand exactly what you're trying to do." Claire narrowed her eyes. "You're making a scene." Walter shook his head. "No, ma'am. You made the scene. We've been quiet. You're the one who can't seem to tolerate us existing near you." Claire's smile dropped. She pressed the call button again, twice this time. When Rachel arrived, Claire didn't even look at her. "I'd like to file an official complaint," she announced. "They're being confrontational. I no longer feel safe sitting next to them. This is a customer safety issue now." Rachel froze. Lewis's jaw tensed. "Ma'am," he began, "there has been no aggression from these passengers." Claire ignored him and turned her head, scanning for someone. "If you won't handle this, I'll escalate it myself." She reached for her phone, tapping the screen like a woman, placing an order she fully expected to be served. The authority in her movements was chilling. She wasn't threatening. She was executing. Walter clenched his jaw, his voice still calm but visibly restrained. "We are not moving, and we are not threatening you. Stop pretending otherwise." Claire looked up from her phone, expression flat. "You've refused multiple polite requests. That's called noncompliance. That's enough for removal under airline policy." She looked toward the rear of the cabin. "Shall I call security myself?" Her tone had shifted, less annoyed now, more smug, like someone confident the end was already written. Lewis stepped between her and the couple. "That won't be necessary," he said, but his words sounded hollow. Claire had turned the narrative from passive insult to faux threat, and she knew exactly how much weight those accusations carried. Behind them, whispers grew louder. A man in 3C muttered, "This is getting out of hand." A woman in 2B turned to her husband and whispered, "Why isn't anyone stopping her?" But no one stood up. Not yet. Not even Rachel, whose discomfort had turned into frozen politeness. Evelyn's hands were trembling now, not with fear, but something worse, shame. Shame that wasn't hers to carry, but was being placed on her shoulders yet again. She turned to Walter and said, voice cracking, "Maybe we should just go." Walter looked at her like she had struck him. "No, it's not worth this," she whispered. "We're not proving anything by staying." But she wasn't asking permission. She was surrendering. She began to reach for her bag. Walter stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Evelyn," he said softly, "we've done nothing wrong." But the moment had shifted. Claire had escalated it. And now even the flight crew was unsure how to de-escalate without consequence. Claire raised her phone slightly, showing the home screen as if it were a weapon. "I'll give you one last chance to move voluntarily," she said, eyes locked on Walter, "or I'll make the call and let security handle it when we land." Now, the silence that surrounded her no longer served her. It isolated her. Naomi turned away from her with clinical finality, not out of spite, but because Claire was no longer relevant to the moment unfolding. She knelt beside her grandmother, speaking softly, while Lewis stood nearby, waiting for further instruction from corporate. Walter remained seated, but something in his posture had changed, not in arrogance, but in reclamation. He no longer looked like a man defending his place. He looked like someone whose place had never needed defending in the first place. Claire's assistant leaned toward her, his voice barely a whisper. "Claire, you need to sit down. People are recording." She didn't respond at first. Her mind was spinning, desperately searching for something to ground her, something that could still give her control. "He's just a shareholder," she muttered. "They're overreacting." Her assistant stared at her, speechless, then quietly pulled out his phone and typed something. Claire noticed. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "Checking with legal," he said without looking up. They already started a file. Claire's stomach dropped. Just then, Rachel reappeared, holding a tablet with the airline's secured internal platform displayed. She approached Lewis and Naomi, speaking just loudly enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "Headquarters just uploaded his full credentials," she said, nodding toward Walter. "They want us to formally acknowledge him before landing." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Credentials?" Rachel turned slightly, her tone measured but firm. "Mr. Walter Rhodes, retired lieutenant colonel, former Tuskegee Airman, Distinguished Service Cross, senior advisor to the current board chairman, and founder of the Rhodes Initiative for Aviation Diversity." Her voice didn't carry mockery or revenge, only fact. And the facts hit harder than anything else could have. Claire stared at Walter as if seeing him for the first time. She saw the precise line of his suit, the unwavering calm in his face, and the weight of the history behind his silence. For the first time in years, Claire Bancroft had nothing to say. She sat down slowly, her hand slipping from the armrest to her lap. Her shoulders fell, not in defeat, but in something more unfamiliar: exposure. Naomi stood now, speaking clearly as she addressed Lewis and Rachel. I've also been asked to inform you that my position as legal counsel to the Diversity Board has been expanded, effective immediately. The CEO will be informed that I'm assuming interim oversight of conduct compliance, starting today. Claire's head snapped up. What? She hissed. You can't just walk in here and restructure the chain of command. Naomi turned to her, no longer cold, just done. I didn't walk in. I've been here. You just never saw me. The ripple effect through the cabin was immediate. A man in 3C quietly applauded. A woman across the aisle nodded toward Naomi with open respect. Others, who had remained silent through the tension, now looked at the Rhodes family with the recognition they deserved. For Evelyn, it was overwhelming. Her hand found Walter's again, and this time, when their fingers touched, her grip was firm, not searching for safety, but anchoring herself back in the moment. Walter looked at her, and they didn't speak, but something between them repaired itself in that quiet gaze, something deeper than pride or pain. Claire watched it all, and something hollow began to widen in her chest. She had underestimated them, not just their status, but their strength. She had assumed that money, appearance, and tone defined worth. She had relied on a world that rewarded arrogance and appearance, and now that world was looking back at her with cold clarity. Her voice, once her most potent tool, now felt foreign in her throat. She opened her mouth, but said nothing. Rachel stepped forward again. Headquarters also confirmed that the Rhodes family has unrestricted access to any cabin space of their choosing on all current and future flights. First class, business, or otherwise. Claire blinked, stunned. You're giving them immunity? No, Naomi said. We're giving them what they already earned. Evelyn remained frozen, one hand still resting on the strap of her bag, her fingers trembling slightly. Walter stood beside her, shoulders drawn tight, breathing shallow through clenched teeth. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against him, not just as a man refusing to give up a seat, but as someone being watched for how much more he could take before he broke. And just as the moment threatened to collapse into something irreversible, a voice from the rear of the cabin cut through the tension. Excuse me. It was firm, young, and calm. Heads turned. Naomi Rhodes stepped forward from the economy section, her dark blue blazer pristine, her walk composed, deliberate, and steady despite the turbulence of the situation she was entering. She passed the divider into first class like someone who didn't need permission. Her curls were pulled back neatly, her eyes sharp and focused. She looked first at her grandparents, reading their faces in an instant, the strain, the fatigue, the fracture forming between them. She turned next to Claire. Are you the one threatening them with removal? Claire raised an eyebrow. And who exactly are you? She asked, her tone already laced with the same reflexive superiority. I'm Naomi Rhodes, the woman said, pulling a card from her pocket and handing it to Lewis. Attorney, special counsel to the board, and granddaughter to the couple you just tried to humiliate in front of an entire cabin. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was seismic. Claire didn't react at first. She blinked, glanced at the card, then laughed, a single cold, dismissive sound. Cute, she said, turning back toward Rachel. Is this supposed to scare me? A lawyer playing hero from row 17. Naomi didn't flinch. She addressed Lewis now, calm and clear. You might want to contact your operations director. Now, Lewis, who had already seen enough, took the card and moved swiftly to the galley. Claire watched him go, her confidence unwavering. This is absurd, she muttered. People like you throw the word lawyer around like it's supposed to mean something. Naomi turned to face her fully. It does, especially when it comes with executive access codes and board-level clearance. Claire's expression finally faltered, not with fear, but with confusion. She looked at Naomi again, this time actually seeing her. Naomi didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence did the talking. Minutes passed with an unbearable stillness as Lewis returned, holding a phone against his ear, his other hand clutching a tablet with a real-time directive flashing across the screen. His face had changed. The neutrality was gone, replaced by something tighter. "Ms. Bancroft," he said carefully, "I've just spoken directly with headquarters." Claire didn't look up. "And," she said, still bored. "You're to cease all engagement with passengers roads immediately," he said, voice steady. "Effective now." Claire scoffed. "Based on what?" "Based on the fact," Lewis continued, "that Mr. Walter Rhodes is a principal shareholder in this airline and a former advisor to our board of directors. Your behavior is now considered an incident of executive misconduct." The word misconduct hit like thunder. Claire's head snapped toward Naomi, who had stepped back beside her grandparents. Evelyn remained seated, stunned into silence, while Walter looked at his granddaughter with something between disbelief and restrained pride. Claire stood slowly, her voice tight. "This is ridiculous. I had no way of knowing who they were." "That's the problem," Naomi said. "You didn't care who they were. You assumed they didn't matter. And now you're finding out in front of everyone that they do." Claire turned to Lewis. "You can't possibly expect me to apologize to—" "No one asked for an apology," Naomi interrupted. "We're beyond that." She stepped closer now, her voice still calm but cutting. "You asked for security. I suggest you wait in the galley. I'm sure corporate will have someone meet you when we land." The passengers around them were no longer whispering. Many were openly watching, some with quiet vindication, others with uncomfortable realization. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her hand dropping from her bag. Walter remained standing, but his grip on the seat had loosened. Claire, for the first time, had nothing to say. She turned toward her assistant, who sat paralyzed, face pale. "We need to fix this," she muttered. "It's already being fixed," Lewis said, "without your help." The tires kissed the tarmac with a firm, grounded thud, but for Claire Bancroft, the landing didn't feel like arrival. It felt like judgment. The plane taxied along the runway in silence, broken only by the mechanical hum of the engines and the distant screech of rubber on concrete. Claire sat frozen in her seat, her phone still buzzing in her trembling hand, though she no longer checked the screen. She knew what the messages said. She knew what was waiting beyond the cabin door. Minutes before touchdown, a discreet call had been patched through to Lewis from the airline's board, conducted over secure satellite link. The tone was cold, the language surgical. Claire Bancroft, CEO, would be terminated immediately upon landing. Not suspended, not placed under investigation. Terminated. Effective the moment the aircraft came to a full stop. The cabin lights brightened. Seatbelt signs blinked off. Passengers stirred in their seats, gathering belongings, pretending not to stare. But they stared. Cameras rolled again, not covertly this time, but openly, without shame. Claire remained still, back rigid, face pale. Her assistant sat beside her, silent, no longer attempting to intervene. The crew, once deferential, now moved past her with professional neutrality. Claire Bancroft was no longer the center of the cabin. She was its cautionary tale. At the front, Lewis conferred quietly with two uniformed men waiting just outside the jet bridge, airport security, discreet but unmistakable. Behind them, a representative from corporate stood with a digital clipboard, expression unreadable. Naomi, watching from across the aisle, observed without triumph. There was no joy in this ending, only inevitability. Her hand still held Evelyn's gently, while Walter sat with the same composed dignity he'd carried through every moment of turbulence, both literal and personal. The cabin door opened. Cool air seeped in, fresh but sharp. Claire looked up at Lewis, as if expecting one last chance to explain herself, to salvage something from the wreckage of her authority. But Lewis didn't speak. He simply nodded once to the representative outside. Claire rose slowly, her body moving as if underwater, her fingers white around the handle of her handbag. As she stepped into the aisle, silence fell again, different now, reverent in its own way, as if marking the final movement of a fallen icon. She walked past row 1, where Walter and Evelyn sat in dignified stillness. Her eyes didn't meet theirs. Evelyn didn't look up. Walter did, just once, just long enough. Claire stepped out through the forward cabin door, escorted not forcefully, but officially, by 2 security personnel and the corporate rep. She exited through a service corridor rather than the standard gate, a separate, hidden path, not for VIPs, but for liabilities. But even that quiet exit wasn't enough to spare her. Just beyond the gate, a wall of press waited like vultures circling a carcass. Cameras flashed the moment she appeared. Reporters shouted questions over each other. "Claire, did you know who he was? Do you deny the accusations of discrimination? Was this your first time targeting passengers based on race?" Claire didn't answer. She kept walking, eyes fixed forward, steps tight, head low. But the clicks didn't stop. The headlines were already writing themselves. Inside the plane, Lewis made a brief announcement thanking passengers for their patience and cooperation. His voice was calm, composed, but everyone knew what had just happened. Naomi leaned back in her seat. She didn't smile, but she did breathe easier. Evelyn glanced at her, then at Walter, and said softly, "I never thought I'd live to see someone like her get walked off that plane." Walter replied, "I didn't think I'd still be standing when it finally happened." Naomi nodded once, letting the moment settle. "This wasn't about revenge," she said. "It was about stopping the cycle. And now it's broken." Flight attendants resumed final duties. Some passengers applauded discreetly. Others simply watched the Rhodes family with newfound respect. And somewhere in the back, someone whispered, "It's about damn time." Claire's name continued to trend globally. Her accounts were locked, her statements delayed, her legal team unreachable. The empire she had built, one flight, one insult, one whispered slight at a time, was collapsing faster than she could have imagined. As the jet bridge was finally cleared, Naomi helped her grandparents to their feet. A crew member appeared beside them, offering to escort them personally to a private lounge, but Walter declined. "We'll walk," he said. "We've earned that much." And so they did, 3 generations, side by side, walking with the quiet dignity that Claire had tried to strip from them. The terminal buzzed behind them, a distant murmur of travelers and overhead announcements. But for the Rhodes family, time moved with a different rhythm now. Quiet, steady, earned. After declining the private lounge and walking the long corridor arm in arm, Naomi, Walter, and Evelyn had been led with ceremony and respect to a reserved suite facing the tarmac. Through the glass, they could still see the aircraft that had carried both insult and vindication suspended on the gate. A new team had already boarded to ready it for its return journey, but the story it carried would never be erased. A representative from the airline's executive board had arrived 10 minutes prior. Respectful, direct, humbled. He had come not just to apologize on behalf of the company, but to offer something more lasting. In his hand was a formal letter, stamped with the board seal, confirming that Naomi Rhodes was to be appointed as the new Director of Equity, Justice, and Inclusion, a role created specifically in the wake of the scandal, with full oversight authority and direct reporting to the CEO. Naomi didn't speak when she read it. She simply passed it to her grandfather. Walter adjusted his glasses and read every word. When he finished, he nodded once, then folded the letter neatly and placed it in his jacket pocket. He didn't smile, but his hand reached for Evelyn's and held it with quiet strength. Claire, meanwhile, had been quietly escorted off the airport grounds through a restricted exit. Her name had already been removed from the company's website, her access revoked. Her executive suite in Manhattan was being packed up under supervision. Her career, once defined by power plays and perfectly sculpted control, had unraveled in less than 6 hours. There would be no press conference, no statement, only silence, and the echo of a reputation shattered by its own reflection. Back inside the airport, Naomi stood with her grandparents near the observation window as a technician approached the aircraft outside. He peeled off the old nameplate near the front fuselage and revealed a new decal beneath it, freshly printed, already sealed in place. In gold letters over a midnight blue banner, the new name gleamed in the morning light, the Rhodes Legacy. Evelyn's hand went to her mouth. For the first time since the flight began, she wept, not out of sadness, but release. Walter placed an arm around her, steady as ever. Naomi said nothing. She didn't need to. The name spoke for all of them. Inside the cabin, the airline had reset the scene, not out of denial, but out of respect. The seats in row 1A and 1B had been cleaned, re-prepped, and a pair of champagne flutes waited, perfectly chilled, beside them. When the flight crew invited the Rhodes family to reboard for a short commemorative ceremony, Walter at first declined. "I think I've spent enough time in that seat," he said dryly. But Naomi looked at him and replied, "No, this time you sit without being questioned." So he did, and so did Evelyn. As they settled back into their original seats, the cabin crew offered a quiet toast. No applause, no cameras, just one flight attendant raising her glass and whispering, "To dignity," and to those who never stopped carrying it. Walter raised his glass. Evelyn raised hers. Naomi stood behind them, one hand on each shoulder. For a moment, the three of them sat still, held in the silence of memory. After the ceremony, Naomi made her way to the main terminal, where press had gathered, invited this time officially. She stood behind a podium, flanked by the airline's board chair and operations director, and read a brief statement. She didn't name Claire. She didn't speak of revenge. She spoke of change. She spoke of representation, of structural bias, of policy reform and corporate responsibility. She announced a new code of conduct, a new passenger protection policy, a new review system for staff behavior, customer complaints, and escalation protocol. And at the end, she spoke one last line, not as a lawyer, but as a granddaughter. No one should have to defend their right to belong, especially not while buckled into seat 1A. The statement trended globally within minutes. But the Rhodes family didn't see most of it. They had already left the airport, headed toward home. The car was quiet. Evelyn leaned against Walter's shoulder. Naomi sat in the front, watching the road, her expression unreadable. In the rearview mirror, she caught her grandfather's reflection. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything that hadn't been said was understood. Not all wounds had healed, but justice, at last, had spoken. The end. If you've made it this far, thank you for reading. This story was built to challenge injustice, honor dignity, and remind us that silence is never the answer. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story hit you the hardest? What would you have done in Walter or Evelyn's shoes? Tell us where in the world you're reading from, and let us know in the comments. Do you think Claire deserved her downfall, or should she have faced more? If powerful, emotional stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. More stories of truth, justice, and redemption are on the way.